What is up, watchers? Thank you guys for tuning in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whenever you're watching. And if you're watching from the distant future, I bet the distant future, even if it's 10 years from now, or 2 years or 3 years from now, it is drastically different from 2021 because we develop so fast. You know what I mean? In my last video on this topic, which you can see either here or here, wherever it is, I touched briefly or give you guys a glimpse of the mind of an INTJ and how we think, how we operate. Now, I like to think I'm a very self-aware person, and when I first found out that I'm an INTJ, and I really got into what this entails, my eyes became more open as to why we have certain flaws and why they operate in the way they do. How sometimes I can be extremely patient and then other times I'm extremely impatient. Well, in this video, we're gonna look at some of the weaknesses of an INTJ. But before we begin, if you're new to the channel and you like a different perspective on life from what society gives you, click that subscribe button and come join the watchers. And feel free to comment down below if at any point you feel as though anything I've mentioned you can relate to. With that being said, let's talk. Number 1, detached from reality. Now, INTJs, we're very mental persons. Everything focuses in our minds. We have these great, complex, entire universes in our minds alone. Fun fact, when I was in school, my sister and I would walk to school together, right? And she would have to engage me in conversation before we start walking to school, because if she didn't, I would start imagining. And pretty much my body goes in autopilot and I'm not there consciously. But it's how INTJs operate. We tend to take fragments of reality, little bits and pieces from what happens around us, and bring it into our mind, process it, and try to understand how it operates, how it works. If you're an INTJ, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And some other personality types do this as well, but particularly with INTJs. You might have a friend or someone you know that does something. You're gonna look at that particular action, bring it into your mind, overthink it, try to interpret why it was done and the reason behind it. And before long, you're gonna already come to a conclusion in your mind as to why that action happened. When something happens in the real world, we don't investigate it in the real world per se. We bring it into our minds and consult our own self to find the answer to what's happening in the real world. The problem with this is that because of how we do it sometimes, we can miss very small but important details in reality, and more times than we would notice, our interpretation is wrong because we didn't get all of the information. We took specific things that we deem necessary and then we make our interpretation. Now, the reason why sometimes our perception of reality is very different from what it actually is not just because we miss certain details, but it's the reason why we miss certain details. INTJs, we're very logically based persons. We understand things very, very black and white. The problem is that not many persons operate like that. That's why we're one of the rarest personality types. Not many persons think like that. And so when we look at an action and interpret it into our mind as meaning a specific thing, that person might not actually be doing that for that same reason because they're different from us. People don't do the same things we do and for the same reason we do it for. I'll circle back to that point a bit later on. Ironically, most of my current and past friends are INTJs. I think even my mother is an INTJ. Anyways, the point is this. INTJs are sometimes detached from reality because we don't look to reality for answers. We look within ourselves. And sometimes because of how we think and it being very different from how most people think, our interpretations and assumptions can be wrong. We can be convinced of something in our head that this is reality, but in actuality, that is not exactly what it is. Number 2, being out of touch with reality is one thing, but what really makes it a weakness is arrogance. So number 2, arrogance. We don't believe in something unless we're convinced it is a thing. Above all, INTJs favor intellect, and that's why we choose jobs that are more intellectually stimulating. Here's the thing. When we convince ourselves of something, you have to come with very sound evidence and sound reasoning to change our minds. And this is where the arrogance comes in, because we're so confident in what we know that it sometimes overshadows whatever you're trying to say. or present to us. So our confidence comes across very arrogant because of how confident we are in what we know. On the other side of the coin, there may be a superiority complex involved. Many times, though it might not be vocalized or an INTJ might not judge you directly, but once you demonstrate a limited capacity in reasoning and rational thinking, we don't take your word for it. Your words do not have much meaning. It goes through one ear and comes through the other. And especially if you are a boss. Number 3, emotional intelligence. This is the fundamental deficiency that contributes to our weaknesses. Because emotion plays such a large part in decision making and how people act, and at the same time we steer away from emotions, it causes a significant gap in our ability to understand people. Empathy is a large part of emotional intelligence. It helps you to understand the why behind the way people feel and the decisions that they make. There are 2 contributing factors to the way something makes someone feel or when they make decisions, and that is comfort and experience. What do I mean by that? People make decisions because of how it makes them feel. That is why I say people are more selfish than you realize, because even charity, for example, most people do it only because they feel good about it. And if doing charity made you feel bad, then a significantly less amount of persons would actually do charitable acts. But I digress. Comfort is one end and experience is the other end. People make decisions because of the life they've lived and the experiences that they've had in their lives. Emotional intelligence helps one to see these things and act accordingly. But INTJs, we wouldn't see these things in many cases because we don't look externally for answers. We look inside. I would often say that logic is like the physical and consequential part of life, while emotions is more like the spiritual part of life, the intangible part, if you know what I mean. But this is why INTJs sometimes come across callous or being cold, because your emotions is something that we would rather not have to process. All the things that I've mentioned before now can technically be considered strengths of ours. It is because of how we're able to create complex and vast worlds in our own minds is why we become so innovative and can lead in revolutionizing things. It gives us the ability to predict quite accurately the consequential parts of life and the mechanical parts of life. We're also able to see the bigger picture, and that's why we're able to say what really matters and what doesn't in many cases. The mind is a really terrible thing to waste, and that is why we put so much emphasis on its development. But because of the lack of emotional intelligence, these strengths becomes a two-edged sword. The lack of the realization that everyone has their own experiences and identity and personality and rationale and reasoning. I'm not saying that INTJs are just inconsiderate. In fact, we're deeply caring people. But there's definitely a shift to the more algorithmic side of life. Granted, for the most part, the world puts an emphasis on the emotional aspect of life, which is kind of why the world is where it is today. People are always feeling something. The world is just so emotional now. But balance is what's really the key. Anyways, personally, I've had a very interesting journey with emotional intelligence. I don't know if this changes my personality type, but I'm now more cognizant of the whys behind people's actions. I'm still extremely logic-based. I'm able to see the bigger picture, but I'm able to also see people and their consciousness. And all of these weaknesses that I've mentioned, I've seen these things play out in real life because I've had a lot of INTJ friends. I've not like a lot of friends, but I've seen these weaknesses play out in my friends and in myself. I've had friends who were so detached from reality and they're convinced in their head of what is really happening, and they've made decisions based on that were wrong because they think they understand what's happening, but they forget to understand and realize that other people might think differently from you, or people might have different reasons for doing things. And what we gotta realize is that the way someone does something sometimes, even because it's different from us, it might not necessarily be inherently wrong or objectively wrong. It's just different from us. So when you see someone would do something, it's not that they have a nefarious reasoning for doing it. They might be doing that because that's their experience, that their experiences in their life drove them to make that decision. I've been guilty of doing this before. These are genuine limitations. At work, I was known for being extremely arrogant. One of the reasons why I eventually figured this out was because I always try to keep like an open communication between myself and my employees, and they were confident enough to say, "You're a dick." But as I learned more about communication, I recognized that the way I communicate a lot of times, it does come across very condescending. We might be dreaming of something in our minds that might not even be the actual thing in reality. This is why we might overestimate our own abilities sometimes. But if you're an INTJ watching this, my advice to you would be to stop sometimes and remember that people don't always think logically, and they don't always think the way we think. I think at least that was the first thing I did. And once I did that, my eyes became open to so many different gray areas. That's the thing. That's the first thing I realized, that there were so many gray areas. There's so many different things that persons would do for different reasons and for different outcomes and with different reactions. And once I really realized that, then I started to realize and I started to see patterns in what would make someone do something in a different way, or what would make someone feel a certain way because of something specific. You know what I mean? If you want to see a video about this whole emotional intelligence thing, leave a comment down below and I'll get to it. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell to be notified whenever I upload a new video. Like this video and share it also with one of your INTJ friends. Maybe they can learn a thing or two. And enjoy the rest of whenever you're watching.